US had won, the Cold War would probably have ended a little sooner. In Southeast Asia, everything would be radically different, including a faster and more thorough confrontation between the USA and China. China would have not sat by and let an American victory happen without repercussion, even though they were not exactly fans of the Vietnamese either. Also regarding the internal politics, if you look at the US presidential elections since the 1960s, every one of them has been fought over Vietnam to one extent or another. Had they come out of that smiling, with another greatest generation on their hands, US politics would have looked quite different. For instance, it is hard to see the Republican Revolution taking place. Republicans typically have an aggressive foreign policy, it is one of their tropes, but if Democratic policy had won in Vietnam, because it was the Democrats who started the war in Southeast Asia, that would have taken a lot of heat away from their rivals. But on the other hand, because of the victory in Vietnam, USA would have been much less gun-shy during the 1970s and 1980s. The reason the US did not rely on its military, on any great scale at least, to solve problems during the 1970s and the 1980s was all down to the country's failure in Vietnam. Now let us see, how would things have changed in neighboring Cambodia? When the Vietnam War began to cross into Cambodia, it created the environment in which Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge came to power. What resulted was a 4-year Holocaust. If the US was ever going to win the Vietnam War, it would have been during the Tet Offensive of 1968, and that was the turning point in the war. In our scenario, the US had repelled that attack quickly and conclusively, and the war was essentially over as a result. At that point in time, the Khmer Rouge was not a big player in the conflict, and a victorious USA in Vietnam is not required to entrance into Cambodia, and, as a result, we are not seeing the rise of the Khmer Rouge. After the US victory, you don't see the situation like in Korea where the Communist North and the Democratic South are split down the middle. So we have a big American victory, and a reunification of the country is under non-communist rule. And now we have one of the trickiest part of the puzzle. If John F. Kennedy had not been assassinated, would the Vietnam War have been avoided? The pro-Kennedy forces argue he wanted to withdraw most of the 16,000 military advisors that were over there. However, what is not mentioned is that before Kennedy there were only 600 military advisors over there. He had begun a war over there, and there are two things that still would have hamstrung him, even if he wanted out. The first is that he still wanted his political party to win another term, and if the Democrats had wiped their hands of Vietnam, there is a good chance they would not have achieved that. The second is that Kennedy wanted his brother to be the next man in the White House. To mess that up, by handing Vietnam to the communists, would have sunk this. I would also argue that Robert McNamara, who was Kennedy's confidant in the first place, and the architect of the Vietnam War, was going to give him the same advice he gave Lyndon B. Johnson, which was to go in with all guns blazing. You have to remember that both Kennedy and Johnson faced the post-World War II consensus, to fight a difficult, problematic and long war against what they perceived as a communist threat, or to embark on